Hello and welcome to Unqualified Opinions. I'm Will Byron, joined by the man, the not really a myth, sort of a legend, the king of college basketball, Jared DeHaan. Jared, how you doing, buddy?
Doing great. It's great to be back. It's been a while since I've been in the studio, so.
All right, enough of this. Let's get into it, Jared. So how are you feeling about the college basketball season so far? I mean, it's kind of a return to form. There's more games. The fans are back. We've seen some great performances from some surprising players this year. What do you think of the season as a whole, as a fan?
I think this season's been really good, and it's been kind of hard to tell who the great teams are. I mean, you've got Gonzaga, of course, who is rolling through the West Coast Conference, which we thought was going to be a little more competitive this year, but they've shown they're still a top team. But you look down the list of the next 24 teams in the top 25, just a couple weekends ago, like 15 teams in the top 25 lost at least once that week, with like 4 teams losing twice. So you just never know what you're going to expect during the year.
Yeah, I was going to ask you next. Some people have argued, I've heard 2 arguments about kind of the top tier of teams this year. One is that there's not really any teams who are like good enough to be a normal season standout contender. There's arguments that this is not an especially talented, group of players right now, just in the league as a whole. The other argument is like, there's so much parity that no team can stand out above the rest. Do you think it's that? Do you think we just have a lot of great teams this year? Or do you think kind of compared to normal years, there's not really a team to really remember?
I think that there's a lot of really good teams, but right now Gonzaga is the only great team I see. I think you've got teams like Auburn, Baylor, Kansas, among several others that are doing really well this year. Kentucky being one of them, but they have these off games where they just look absolutely terrible against really average to bad teams. Like you got Auburn, who almost lost a couple weeks ago at Mizzou. Mizzou is, I believe, 10-18 at this point.
Well, and Auburn just lost to Florida, who's
17 and 11.
A little bit over 500, but they're a bubble team. So.
They're a bubble team, so it's like you just never know what to expect. I think it makes for a really fun March and April for March Madness, but it's one of those things that when you're going to be filling out your bracket, you really have no idea what to expect. I think there's going to be more upsets this year than there has ever been, and it's been pretty fun to watch these last couple years. So I think it's going to be an intense March Madness this year.
So on to the main point, Jared. Bubble watch. What you got for us? Who's right on the edge there?
So I've got my last 4 in, my first 4 out, and my next 4 out. My last 4 in, it includes a couple of the we call mid-majors, but at this point, I don't even think you consider them mid-majors anymore, just because they're constantly in the running and right there for March Madness. But my first one is San Francisco. The Dons have been a projected team this entire year. They're only 9-5 in the West Coast, which we're like, are they good enough to make it in? But I think they've shown enough throughout the year. They're 22-7. That's a pretty good record compared to some other teams in my bubble watch. They haven't had as good of opponents, but I think they've shown enough that they have the chance to make it pretty decent. I think even to the second weekend in March.
And the West Coast does have kind of 4 teams that have a shot at the tournament.
Yeah, so they have
Gonzaga, obviously.
Gonzaga, St. Mary's, and San Francisco. And then there's also BYU, who I'm going to get to a little bit later. But those 4. And then you've got Santa Clara, who's a 5th team that could make it to the NIT. They've been one that people have overlooked the entire year, but they've beat a couple of these teams I've talked about. You look at Indiana about 3 weeks ago.
I don't want to.
You would have been like, they're an easy, almost lock. They were 16-5. They were almost in the top 25. Well, they've lost their last 5, and I've watched several of these games, and they have looked very average. I'm keeping them in just from what I've seen throughout the year and some of their games where they've won, but like they just lost to Ohio State in overtime. And Ohio State is in the top 25, has looked pretty good this year, but they still can't get over that hump. They're just on the slide, and I don't know when it's going to end.
Would you say that Indiana really has any major firepower aside from Trace Jackson Davis?
I think they've got a lot of decent guards, and then Race Thompson, who's usually their 4-man, he's good too, but I think the guards have to step up to be able to make it into March. I have them hanging on in this last 4 in, but they're going to have to finish out. I think they have 4 or 5 games remaining. They need to win at least 3 of them, and then 1 game in the Big Ten to make sure they make the tournament.
Who you got next for us, Jared?
I've got San Diego State out of Mountain West. They're 17-7. They've been playing really well recently. Now the Mountain West has several other good teams like Wyoming. You've got Colorado State. And then you had somebody who was supposed to be really good this year in Utah State, but they've kind of fallen off the map. They were one I was expecting to be second or maybe even win this year, but they've fallen off the map. They're going to have to win out and win their conference to make it in. But San Diego State's really just hanging on there. They don't have very many good opponents left, so they're going to have to make it far in the tournament or of the Mountain West tournament to really solidify their spot in March Madness.
Yeah, I was going to say, man, Mountain West is pretty stacked this year, honestly. I think I've talked about them before. It's kind of like an underrated, basketball conference just for college sports. I mean, you got Colorado State, Boise State, Wyoming.
I didn't even mention Boise State. Boise State went on like a 14-game winning streak earlier this year. So you've got at least 3 teams that are in the tournament, possibly a 4th. When you thought Utah State would have been the 5th team, but they've kind of fallen off this year.
Hey man, Mountain West coming up, right? Who's our last team? And then did you rank this in kind of like reverse order?
Yes.
Or is like this last team?
This will be my last team in. My last team in is a team that I didn't even have on my radar. I had them written out just a month and a half ago, and that's Memphis. Memphis has won 6 of last 7. They won at Houston a couple games ago. They're now 15-9. Penny Hardaway is somehow getting this team put back together. When you would have looked at a month and a half ago, you thought this team had fallen off the rails. I thought they didn't even have a shot at making the NIT, but somehow they've found their stroke. They just lost their last game at SMU 73-57. If they would have won that game, they probably would have been in my last 4 buys because that would have been 7 straight. So I think they need to get back on track and win. I would say at least win their last 2 games and make it to the semifinals of the American.
I was going to say, man, Memphis is a team I have no idea what to do with. They have a big name coach. They have 2 of the bigger name kind of recent reclassification loophole guys, Jalen Duren and Imani Bates, who's been he's been considered the next Kevin Durant or the next this and that, whoever. He's been kind of tabbed as the next big thing in basketball since he was 13 or something. So far that really hasn't played out for them, but it's a weird roster full of ultra hyped, kind of young AAU players. Some got guys like Landers Nolly and Earl Timberlake who feel like they've been around for 8 years.
Forever. So. It's just one of those teams that I saw them at the beginning of the year. I'm like, finally, Penny Hardaway has this team. This team is going to be amazing. They're going to be a top 10 team. Oh. I was really wrong. From the very beginning, they just looked off. And, their loss against Georgia is probably the second worst Power 5 team this year. They have been terrible. Tom Crean cannot get that team together. So
second worst? Who's worse?
Nebraska.
Shut up, Jared.
Wow.
I'm sorry, but...
Moving on.
These will be my first 4 out. These will be so the first team out is Dayton. Dayton got that huge early season win over Kansas. At that point, they were 1-3 and lost against a couple very average teams. But they've won their last 4 straight. They were right there in the running for the regular season title in the Atlantic 10. Atlantic 10 is not as deep as it usually is, but up there in the top 4 or 5 teams are very strong. So they have enough wins there, but they're on my first 4 out. They're 19-8. I think they need to make it to the semifinals or win the Atlantic 10 tournament to solidify their shot, but there's just not enough good wins in the Atlantic 10 to move them any up higher for now.
I was going to say Atlantic 10's usually a threat to send 2, sometimes 3. They're kind of one of those gray areas between, low majors, mid major. They're above a mid major,
but they're not quite
a power conference.
And this year is just one of those things, if they were a little bit deeper, I'd take them more serious, but it's just a little top heavy. And once you get to the bottom, you've got teams
I know they had St. Bonaventure, who was top 25 coming into the season, who's they're 18-7 now, so they're kind of out of that conversation.
So next on my list is BYU. BYU was easily in the tournament, but they're 5th now in the West Coast Conference. So they're behind Santa Clara, or in the conference standings. Santa Clara is not even in my discussion, but BYU just lost to Pacific. Pacific is really bad. I don't think people realize how bad of a loss that was. And so when BYU lost that, it dropped them out, put them in my first 4. They're going to have to at least make the conference championship to be just on that line of last 4. And I don't think they have enough work ahead of them to boost them up any higher. And they just haven't beat the good teams in the conference. And then they lost to a terrible team in the West Coast Conference.
So how concerned are you, just real quick, looking at the talent they've had recently? They've had some really good players. Alex Barcel now is a great player. How long do you think will take for them to be competitive at the Big 12 level?
It's going to be tough. I mean, if they're fifth right now on the West Coast, and you look at the Big 12, you look at all the teams are above 500 as far as I know, and several of them are hovering around that 500, but everybody's beaten up on each other in the Big 12, and BYU's lost to Pacific in the West Coast. I just don't know that they're going to have the horsepower to be competitive. Now, it might take several years, and they'll get back up there, but it's going to take a lot of recruiting efforts to get them competitive in that Big 12 conference. Next, in my first four out is Southern Methodist. I just talked about earlier how Southern Methodist beat Memphis by 16, but Memphis has had a couple better wins. Memphis beat Alabama earlier in the season, which was a huge win for them. SMU just doesn't really have that signature win. They did beat Houston. Houston has lost a couple other games, so it's not as like, oh my gosh, that's a great win. Still a good win, but they just don't have enough else going for them in their win-loss column. They're going to have to, I think, win the American to make the NCAA tournament.
I was going to say, I've seen a lot of noise on social media. I think ESPN or Bleacher Report, one of those two, had Memphis over SMU as well. Reactions were not positive.
It's really close, and honestly, it's probably Memphis's win over Alabama, which is a little more striking. I mean, Alabama is like 17-10, 18-10 at this point, but Alabama's had some crazy good wins and a lot of bad losses.
It's the crazy thing about college basketball. I mean, it's so focused now on like seeding's so focused on quadrant wins, you know?
It's not as much. I think there's just so much other, like the quad one, quad two takes is what you look at and not exactly the head-to-head in this case scenario.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like the quad win just mean like, one, Memphis gets the advantage over SMU there because they have a quad win at Alabama, and two, if a team starts to suck and they drop out of quad one, like you see teams rising. Like North Carolina had no quad one wins last week, and now they have two because two teams rose up.
That's the confusing about. It's weird. That's the really confusing thing, and they're going to have to, because the net is a very different kind of ranking system. So I think it's going to take several years before that becomes like really easy to understand for just normal college basketball fans to be like, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense. But right now it's like it's still in pretty much the very beginning of what they want it to look like and how the metrics go about. And then my last team in the first four out is Oregon. Oregon's lost 3 of the last 4. I thought they were going to be really good at the beginning of the year. They had that game where they almost beat Baylor, and I thought they should have beat Baylor, and that would have been a huge boost to their resume. But Pac-12 is top-heavy with the 3 teams in Arizona, USC, and UCLA. And after that, you get to teams like Oregon State, Utah, Washington State and Washington, who were doing really well, but have now both like lost their last 5. So in that kind of conference, being 17-10 just doesn't do anything for you. If you're 17-10 in a conference like Big 12 or Big 10, there's enough quality wins going down the list that it starts to get a lot of quad 1, quad 2 wins to get you in the tournament. But in the Pac-12, if you're just beating up on teams like Oregon State, Utah, that means nothing when it comes to tournament time.
All right, and then you have your next 4.
I'll just kind of go quickly through this next 4 out. I've got St. Bonaventure, who we actually talked about earlier. They've won 6 straight. They started out 4-4 at Atlantic 10. They also started the year in the top 25. They lost several games they should not have, or we thought they should not have. But I have them in that next 4 out conversation. They're going to have to win out, I think, to make the tournament. But it's just nice to see them get back into a flow and get back to being this good, because they did not start out the year very well. My next team is Florida. Florida 17-11. They're just under 500 in the SEC, which is a good conference, but they got to win out as well, which is going to be really tough when you got teams like Auburn, Kentucky, LSU, Alabama. You've got to go through several good teams. Now, they could pick up a couple teams and they could be right on that edge, but they've lost too many games this year, I think, to really be in that conversation for making the tournament unless they make a run in the SEC tournament. My Next team is Oklahoma. Oklahoma is 14-14. This is like a couple years ago when we had like Minnesota and there was another team it might have been like Indiana who were both hovering around 500 and they were still in the running. And that's because Oklahoma has 4 top 25 wins and they've played, I think, 12 games against AP top 25. That's the reason they're still in this talk, but they've lost 4 straight. They're 4-11 in the Big 12, and that does nothing for you in this case. So they're going to have to win out, which is, again, going to be really tough in a very, very good conference in the Big 12. And then my last team is one team that nobody talked about until a couple weeks ago when they beat Texas and Texas Tech back-to-back, and that's Kansas State. They've lost their last 2. Several weeks ago, they were up 15, I think, at half or 18 at half on Kansas and then lost by 3. That would have been a huge resume boost. They lost that game. They just lost recently to Kansas again by 20 and gave up over 100 points. They've lost their last 2. They're also going to have to win out to make it, which is going to be a really tough task. But never say never. I mean, Kansas State and Oklahoma have had several really good games this year, and then they've had several games where like that is not an NCAA tournament team. So it'll be interesting. I think they both end up in the NIT, and I think both of them could do really well in the NIT because, I mean, playing 18 straight games against Big 12 opponents really gets you ready for any team, honestly. So that's my next 4 out. I think it's going to be really interesting how these last couple weeks play out because there's a lot of good teams fighting for those last couple spots.
Oh, yeah, man, for sure. I mean, we're in crunch time for college basketball. Well, Jared, as always, awesome to have you on the show. Great to talk some college ball with you. Hopefully we'll get you around more for conference tournaments, March Madness picking up, and then me, incessantly calling you late at night to ask you about obscure draft prospects.
See, sometimes people say Christmas is the best time of the year, but, March Madness is the most wonderful time of the year, and you can bet your bottom dollar on that.
Man, I almost feel bad for having to say anything after that, but we'll just leave it at that. We'll wrap it up there. That's our show. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell, all the stuff every person on YouTube ever tells you to do. From Unqualified Opinions, we'll see you guys next time.